So much. We'll be happy to open the floor to questions.
Yeah. Yes. Australia, are any other countries backing away from this kind of thing?
There are other countries. For sure. There are other countries that have started backing away from this kind of thing. Australia is the most prominent. I'd be happy to check the details and find those for you.
The study done by Australia put in place an independent commission to study whether it was actually in the economic benefit of Australia to enter into these investor state provisions. Must be distinguished from trade deals. They're not technically trade deals, but these investor state provisions, all modeled on Chapter 11 of NAFTA, which was the first one, have become fairly commonplace. That basically is the blather you get from Minister Fast as to why this is okay. We have lots of these, they say. Well, we have ones with much smaller economies, and it's true. We have a lot of bilateral agreements on investor state protection. This is by character absolutely different. Australia looked at all of the ones going on around the world and said, does this benefit Australia? Yes, Australian investors may benefit in some countries, but overall, even taking into account the protection of Australian investors in other countries, Australia concluded these kinds of deals as a type of treaty do not benefit Australia, and Australia, based on independent advice, which Canada has never sought. We've never had a cost-benefit analysis of these treaties. Australia did one and decided they don't make sense. Australia will not be getting into them anymore. To my knowledge, it's the only country that's actually done a study, and it's also the only country that said it won't enter into any more of these investor state agreements.
Business investment community raised any red flags over this?
I actually don't know. I'd be interested.
Over which this? Over this treaty? No, overall, one would have to say that the Canadian business community is very encouraged by the fact that there will be protection for Canadian investors in China. And they're right on that. There's no question that Canadian investors in China will be better off with this deal. The question is whether that benefit offsets the enormous risk. And I tell you right now, we will see Canadian governments, federal, provincial, and municipal, looking over their shoulders, wondering if they can pass laws to protect labor standards, to protect the environment, even to improve the rules around in the Investment Canada Act. They'll be looking over their shoulder wondering, will Beijing sue us if we do this? This is fundamentally corrosive to our entire democracy and to our values, and there is no benefit for Canadian business in China that can offset this risk, particularly because of the 31-year lock-in.
Clarify, because this is not the first time there is such a mechanism. There was Chapter 11, which we talked about a couple of years ago. So why would this be so much different from what already exists? And it doesn't seem to create that much problems. And we had the same arguments back then.
So I think one of the most important things, there's a backgrounder which we've been distributing from one of the experts in this, a man called Gus van Harden, which I'd encourage you to have a look through. But one of the most important things is the secrecy that exists within this current agreement. It gives, unlike NAFTA, where if a Canadian government is sued under NAFTA, that becomes public information. It's entirely at the discretion of our government whether or not they make the information on the fact that they've been sued public. So if we're sued, Harper would have no requirement to make that public, and that's a real problem. This could be going on behind closed doors in secret, unaccountable tribunals.
May I also add, I think we are far too sanguine about the impact of Chapter 11 of NAFTA. Canada has lost repeatedly, and the chilling effect is what we're underestimating. In my previous life working at Sierra Club of Canada, there was a moment when the Minister of Health was prepared to consider a ban on the cosmetic use of certain pesticides that cause cancer. There was a letter sent over from trade saying, if you do this, there'll be a Chapter 11 suit under NAFTA from U.S.-based manufacturers of pesticides. It's very hard for Canadians to know the full effect of the investment state provisions under NAFTA, but certainly losing the S.D. Myers case on PCB contaminated waste export, losing or settling outside of the arbitration on the MMT ban, the decisions that have been made that actually have a chilling effect that's quite significant. But again, there's nothing about Chapter 11 of NAFTA that is as fundamentally dangerous to Canada as the arrangements with China, because Chapter 11 of NAFTA gives private sector U.S.-based corporations the right to sue Canada. China doesn't have any private sector-based corporations. Any complaint by a Chinese state-owned enterprise against the government of Canada for decisions made municipally, provincially, federally, territorially, or even by our courts is essentially a complaint by the government of China against the government of Canada. That's why this agreement includes a 6-month diplomatic period before you start arbitration. That's a unique feature.
It's a government instead of a business.
It makes an enormous difference in terms of the relative, it brings in geopolitical concerns, it brings in the economic clout of that government to say, well, all our investors in Canada might be very annoyed if you don't change this law. All of our investors in Canada might have to leave suddenly. All of our concerns about X project or this project. In other words, you're dealing with an intimidation and political power pressure that simply isn't present in NAFTA. And NAFTA was bad enough. I didn't think I'd ever see an agreement that made me miss NAFTA, right? I would like to see the China-Canada Investment Treaty operate on the 6-month exit provisions of NAFTA, not the 31-year lock-in provisions with the government of China. We must insist that at least there be an exit clause so that a future government can get out of this.
China to sue, because right now I think there's 2 cases, one with the windmill situation in the States and one with the Belgian bank. But is this like fear-mongering, or is China like to sue all the time?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious that right now we're looking at 2 suits that we know of. And again, there's no requirement for the launch of suits to be made public. That's at the option of the government being sued, since we know China doesn't want to talk about it. These agreements are relatively new, and we have 2 lawsuits. We have China suing Belgium for $3 billion because a bank went belly up. We have China suing the U.S. over the wind farm that Barack Obama disapproved. I mean, I think what we're talking about here is over a 31-year period, how likely is it that we'll be repeatedly sued? It's not a likelihood, it's a certainty. How likely is it that Canadian governments won't pass laws to improve on the devastation of our environmental laws that has taken place in the last year under Stephen Harper? Repairing the damage of C-38 and C-45 will be foreclosed. This is my opinion. Our ability to repair our environmental laws will be foreclosed by the threat of a suit from China.
Julian and Geoff, Regan, can you just explain what the government says, which is basically, if you're really caught up on this agreement, why didn't you bring it for debate in the House, like on an opposition day? They're basically saying this is
that's a smokescreen. The government has the ability to bring it into the House. They've refused to. We've raised motions. Dan Davies has raised motions a couple of times in the International Trade Committee. Conservatives have refused to have the debate. And the implications are enormous, which is why we've been saying all along, this is a fundamental question of democracy. That what we need to have is that democratic debate. We need to call witnesses in to see the implications, for example, of some of these investor-state suits that we're seeing in other countries, like in Europe, and to what extent that is going to be a result of this FIPA. And I wanted to answer a previous question around the business community and Nexen and CNOOC, as I've traveled into Calgary 3 or 4 times over the last few months on the CNOOC proposal to take over Nexen. And in the business community, there are some supporters there. There are some that will say just the premium on shares is enough for a net benefit to Canada. But I would say, broadly speaking, there is a great deal of concern with this takeover proposal, and there is increasing concern right across this country about this government's mishandling of the Investment Canada portfolio. What we're seeing with Petronas, that decision made at midnight, and the uncertainty around whether or not the CNOOC is going to be rubber stamped as well, is that the business community is looking for a level playing field. They're looking for a real definition of net benefit. They want to know when they approach these issues that there is going to be a process that is clear to everybody and transparent. And the erosion of public confidence that we've seen in Investment Canada over the last few months is a direct result of the government not handling Investment Canada in an effective, transparent, and clear way. So I think for everyone concerned, when we come back to the issue of CNOOC and Nexen, we need very clear rules. We need a public consultation process that's contained within Investment Canada, and that's something that I think investors would want to see, as well as the general public, who is clearly not confident in this government's ability to handle these kinds of transactions.
Julian, you say you stand with Lead Now, and they're firmly against the FIPA with China, but as we've heard here, that there are a lot of companies that really want some kind of certainty if they're going to invest in China. So how do you propose to do that if it's not through FIPA?
But what we've been saying all along, we need a debate, we need to have committee hearings, we need to have witnesses come forward so we know the implications of FIPA. We've asked for an extension. We've said through the International Trade Committee, Dawn Davies proposed that rather than locking it in within the next couple of days, that there be an extension on the ratification process so that parliamentarians can actually delve deep into this FIPA and see what the ramifications are. So we're standing with the more than 60,000 Canadians that have said, don't ram this through. Let's have a debate. Let's have a discussion around FIPA. And we're also standing with the tens of thousands of people that have said that the CNUC deal the takeover is not in Canada's interest, particularly in light of how Investment Canada is structured now. And so we've said, as you know, on October 4th, we said at the National Press Theatre that we were opposed to the deal.
If in fact you had a parliamentary committee looking at this, one of the things you would undoubtedly have there is you would hear from a number of experts. You would hear from independent international law experts who could talk about this deal and talk about their understanding, their knowledge of other deals, of the situation in international trade generally, and how this would fit into it, what problems they see with it. I think it's very valuable to have that kind of discussion, to have that kind of expertise brought before Parliament so that members of Parliament and so Canadians can assess this in a more balanced, a more fair way, and that's the government's not allowing that. And I think that's the essential problem here, is that the government wants to ram this through without the kind of discussion in public that there ought to be.
Just to be clear, are you against this treaty?
We have real problems with this deal, and we think that there ought to be the kind of public discussion that I've talked about.
And the Conservatives say that when you, as Liberals, were government, you'd bring in treaties after they were ratified. They say they have a whole new process whereby at least they bring it into the House, and you have 21 days to talk about it, although we haven't really seen that. But they say the Liberals were way inferior in terms of their democratic approach to treaties.
Well, first of all, I think the government should take responsibility for its own situation. It's been in government for more than 6 years now. It's time they were held to account for their own performance. It's very easy for them to point to what happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 40 years ago, or whatever. But the situation is that they have to be held to account for what they're doing. And as far as we're concerned, they need to have public hearings around this. It's a different kind of deal with, as Elizabeth mentioned, with a very large economy, and it ought to have public discussion.
Can I say, Julie, I've tried to get to some of the research on exactly how treaties have been treated over the years, and I found that Professor Peter Hogg's text on constitutional law in Canada, which I cited in my failed attempt to get the Speaker to allow us an emergency debate, traditionally, governments at their option could decide this is an important treaty. So while there's no requirement that this be passed by Parliament, and the difference is NAFTA and other trade deals like the Canada-Jordan Treaty, we had days of debates, Canada-Panama, days of debates, but there was a requirement with those treaties for implementing legislation. This does not require any implementing legislation. It's on its feet as an investor state provision, standalone, no vote in Parliament needed. But previous governments always looked at a treaty and decided, is this so important that Parliament should, both the House and the Senate, have the bill, and this is described by Peter Hogg in constitutional law texts, put the treaty before each House, allow a vote. There was no need for royal assent because there's no actual legislation, but it was a signal of approval from Parliament before important treaties were entered into. And so, yes, some treaties were tabled after ratification because they were deemed not to be that important. You'll recall, as I do, I've never heard a furor from the House of Commons over a treaty tabled after ratification. Important treaties went to a discussion. They went to a vote. I recall in 2003 that Jean Chrétien put the Kyoto Protocol before Parliament for a vote. It was exactly this type. No implementing legislation required, entirely royal prerogative, at the option of a Prime Minister. Is this important? Do we put it forward to a vote? In contrast, I remember Brian Mulroney, and I was pleased he did it, within 6 months of signing the Biodiversity Convention and 6 months of signing the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Both were ratified by order in Council. It wasn't a secret. They weren't tabled afterwards to anyone's surprise, but there was generally strong consensus. But it wasn't as specific in its relationship to Canada as the Kyoto Protocol. So just to use those, I'm not familiar with all treaties that have gone forward in the last number of decades, but certainly those ones, I can sense why one didn't go to a vote, why the other did. Under Peter Hogg's research, which it's the only thing I can find, more than half of the treaties that have been passed by the Parliament that have been put in force by an ordering councillor under royal prerogative actually went to Parliament for a vote. What the Conservatives have done, and they're very expert in this, is create a process which they can rightly claim is new. As of 2008, all treaties are tabled in the House of Commons for 21 days. But in the absence of a debate and in the absence of a vote, this essentially boils down to being a ritualistic denial of democracy, masquerading as a move towards transparency.
Who's going to pay these potential compensations? It's always been the federal government. It's a federal treaty. So why would that be any different in this case? And why haven't the provinces raised any concerns?
I think that's a really good question, and one of the biggest problems is that we actually just don't know exactly what all the implications of this treaty are. Even the experts that are speaking out are saying we need more time to study this. There's real concern, obviously, that, for example, if, say, the British Columbia government decided they were going to oppose something like the Northern Gateway pipeline, would that mean that they could then be turned around and sued? We haven't had the time to study this, and that's a real problem.
If I can I'm sorry, Matthew, but just to clarify, we know British Columbia couldn't be sued. We do know that Canada could be sued because of a decision by British Columbia. And we do know that as of August 2010, when Prime Minister Harper announced the settlement with Abitibi-Bowwaters of $120 million paid out by the Government of Canada because of a decision of the Newfoundland-Labrador government, Mr. Harper said, we will be developing a mechanism to reclaim from provinces costs that are paid out by the federal government under treaties of this type. So we can absolutely take it as written that Stephen Harper intends to claw back the money from any province that causes an investment claim by China. I asked in the House of Commons on Friday, and the response from the government House Leader, Mr. Van Loan, was not responsive.
Constraining the policy decisions of municipal and provincial governments. They're already bound by WTO agreements. You saw what happened in Ontario with the Green Energy Act. How does this go beyond our obligations at the WTO and constrain provincial policy makers further?
I'm sorry for taking the mic again. It's different from a trade agreement. WTO, General Agreement of Tariff and Trade, we have certain obligations. What this does, and it's unique, and it was Chapter 11 that started it, was the concept, and I spoke to the NAFTA negotiators. They didn't see this coming. They thought they were negotiating in Chapter 11 a pretty straight-up expropriation protection, that if your actual assets were expropriated in the common sense meaning of the word, of course you'd be compensated. And that's what people thought they were negotiating in Chapter 11. It wasn't until Ethel Corporation of Richmond, Virginia, brought the case against Canada on MNT, that, and this was during the time that we were also negotiating in the OECD, the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, alarm bells started going off. And I can tell you they went off in the European Union when they watched Ethel Corporation suing Canada, because it was the first time anyone realized that the term tantamount to expropriation could be used to claim we've lost profits. Or as Emma mentioned, or I think Matthew mentioned in the MMT decision, Ethel Corporation also sued us for the loss of their damage to their reputation because of debates in Parliament about the toxicity of their product. They never denied their product was toxic, by the way. So here you have a situation where tantamount to expropriation can mean we were expecting profits. You, who knows, Fort McMurray changed your bylaw. It's going to hurt our profits, and we think your decision was arbitrary. Guess what? That's the only test, is whether it's arbitrary or, in the alternative, they're not cumulative, or discriminatory towards trade. So if it's arbitrary, and China claims it's arbitrary, they can bring a challenge that is completely not found within the WTO rules. And again, what is government if not arbitrary? I hate to mention it, but you change government. If you're an investor in Canada, particularly from a country that doesn't understand democracy, and you have a conservative government, you may get one set of policies. Elect an NDP government, you're going to set a different set of policies. In the investor-state regime, the fact that the government changed doesn't matter. The change in policy is arbitrary. You're going to owe money.
So we're out of time. I want to thank all of the three MPs for coming and joining us here today. Our community this morning is launching a fundraiser, and we're going to be doing crowd-funded radio ads about this. So we're going to be blanketing Conservative MPs' ridings on this issue. So again, thank you all for coming. We're here to just present the petition with 60,000 Canadians have signed on to, and make sure those concerns are heard. Thank you. Lead Now is almost entirely funded by small donations from our 210,000 person community all across Canada. And we're out of time, sorry. We'll be happy to take more questions, but our MPs have to go to other engagements.